it's up to you. When it's 2019, but it feels like 1933.
Arnie Arneson and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. You know the drill, we're recording on Wednesday morning. So it is Race Class, episode 15. Race Class, for those of you who may have forgotten, because we do it just once a month, we frame it this way. Legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, Boston University law professor Jonathan Feingold and myself are offering Race Class, a once-a-month course/conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history, rather than fear and anxiety. We hold this class every Thursday. It's available by podcast. You can absolutely download it almost virtually anywhere. As Jonathan said, we know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means. So let me welcome Professor Feingold back to the program. Thank you for doing this, Jonathan.
Good morning, Arnie. Always a pleasure to be with you.
And this is year 2, everyone. Oh my goodness, we're all going to end up with a PhD by the time we're done. You sent me the outline, and it was, read this. Why does inequality persist? Organizational culture matters. So before I let you talk, I decided, organizational culture, do I even know what that means? So I decided to look it up. And here's what I did. I first found a quote by Aristotle. Of course, he would know about organizational culture. And Aristotle said, "We are what we repeatedly do." Ooh, do you love that? I love that. We are what we repeatedly do. Organizational culture is the sum of the values, beliefs, practices, and behaviors that contribute to the social and psychological environment of an organization. Why are we talking about organizational culture as we're looking at the attacks on CRT, anti-racism, basically public education, and at the forefront of that are people like Governor Abbott, Governor DeSantis, the governor of Arkansas, the governor of Iowa. I mean, it seems like they're all working off the same script. But when it comes to organizational culture, I think what you're focused on right now is not sort of the generic concept, but really looking at a place where we've seen it in the headlines, which is about schools and public education.
Thanks for the intro and for leading us into the conversation. Part of why I wanted to focus on organizational culture, though I don't mean to make things overly complicated or fancy, but it's in a sense responding to attacks on words like systemic. Because if so, there's this really interesting article from Nick Anderson in the Washington Post, and we can include a link to it, where he just counts the number of times that certain words appeared in the AP African American Studies curriculum in April of 2022, and then how many times those words appeared or didn't appear in February 2023. The word systemic appeared 9 times last April, and it no longer appears. It's gone. The word systemic has been disappeared from the AP African American Studies curriculum. And we know that words like systemic are disliked by individuals like DeSantis. And so part of the question is, well, why does someone like DeSantis view systemic, this word like systemic, as a threat? Like, what is it about it? And because we know that, so DeSantis is on the record essentially characterizing the notion that racism is structural as quote unquote horse manure. Both DeSantis and his representatives denying that systemic injustices exist in the United States. They're on the record. Now, what's important to note is that someone like DeSantis is not denying that racial inequality exists. He's not saying that you don't actually have disparities in school discipline. He's not saying that there isn't a racial wealth gap. What he's saying is that that gap, those disparities, are just.
Oh, I know. This is so interesting that you say this. So I'm looking through your outline. What is highlighted and bolded in blue, everyone? When DeSantis denies injustice exists, he doesn't deny that disparities exist. He implies the disparities are justified. That sentence was like crushing to me because it so explained why he is so vigilant in what he says. Of course, you can show me all the numbers. You can show them to me. But I'm going to tell you, it's because they are justified. Their behavior justifies the fact that they're in prison. The fact that they're poor is justified because they haven't, understood the work ethic. So he doesn't allow you to use the disparities on your side of the aisle. He actually uses those disparities to prove that this is not about systemic, but this is about their behavior, their cause and effect. And until I read that sentence, I didn't quite understand the headset. It's changed a lot for me, Jonathan.
And so one thing that I love doing with students is, so like, you will just provide some data, and then it's like, okay, well, what is your theory as to why the world is the way it is? And all the time we have theories in our head that explain why things are the way they are. And when you take something like systemic off the table, you're actually preventing students from being able to engage a particular theory. You're not preventing students or forcing them to reach a conclusion, but you're just denying them an opportunity to think more comprehensively about why the world might be the way it is. And so I thought today, to sort of concretize the conversation, we could draw on some recent work by Dr. Jayanti Owens from the Yale School of Management, in part also because with all of the attacks on, it's easy to forget that there are really talented people doing really incredible work, just helping us see more clearly all of the various societal forces that lead to the world being the way that it is. And so this conversation that we're going to have today connects to a few conversations that we've been having over the past year plus. One is just, what does it mean to say that race matters? So sure, we know it does, but how, in what ways? And then also, we know, or at least, we think we know, that racism is quote unquote structural, but what does it mean for racism to be structural? Part of what we're doing here is taking ideas seriously and just trying to make ourselves more sophisticated thinkers about these topics. And so just here's a data point. Boys racialized as Black in the United States are 3.2 times more likely to be disciplined than white boys. There's a racial disparity with respect to discipline in schools. It's something that led the Obama administration to attempt to intervene with new school discipline policy guidelines. Unsurprisingly, the Trump administration rescinded those. When we are presented with the fact that certain students of a particular racial identity are disciplined at a higher rate than others, then the question is why? What causes that disparity? And so now, Arnie, I'm just going to ask you, don't say the answer yet, but just think, if you were to poll people on the street, if you were to say, look, we know the data are there, the data are clear, there's a racial disparity when it comes to school discipline, and you say why? Why do you think that disparity exists? The question is, well, what are people on the street going to say? Now, before you tell me those theories, you might say, okay, well, what if I were to tell you that it's actually white girls who are more disciplined than anyone else? You might be surprised at that statistic, but if I say no, that's actually what the data tell us, are the theories as to why going to be different? It's just another way to play with it. Are the theories going to be different? And so now I'll just sort of make the question not rhetorical, but if you were to go onto the street and just ask people, why do you think boys racialized as Black are disciplined at higher rates than boys racialized as white? What do you think the theories are that people are going to tell you?
So is my street in Florida or is my street in Concord, New Hampshire?
Assume you get a cross section of America.
Having read what you said about how DeSantis is, well, maybe these Black kids act up more. Maybe they didn't have good parental involvement. Maybe they don't understand the parameters of behavior. Maybe they came from drug-addled families. I mean, think about that's you can almost check the box of what people are going to say. Or in my community, what they would say is because we are making false assumptions because we see a Black kid and make an assumption about a situation that may not in fact fact exist. Therefore, it is easier to jump to that assumption and then send them to the principal. We would, in fact, forgive a white kid or work with the white kid or say to the white kid, so let's talk about this. And then you wouldn't automatically send them to the principal because you are sort of in your own sort of persona of your own self as white, saying, oh, I kind of understand their experience. I am going to prepare to forgive them. But then your understanding of the Black experience, which has been so limited and so racialized, again, you understand why people will respond differently because their knowledge is so different.
And so certainly who you ask, the answer will depend, but you did a really, I think, effective job of highlighting sort of two sort of prevailing theories. One is, well, that disparity is justified because certain kids misbehave more than other kids. So that's sort of the DeSantis theory.
Right.
The gap exists, but it's just. Everyone listening should know that that has effectively been debunked through actual empirical scholarship. Now, it's not to say that there aren't some behavioral differences observed, but you actually might be able to explain those behavioral differences through actual rational reasons. Part being that teachers tend to interact with certain students differently than other students, which can then lead to sort of recursive processes. But I'm just going to put that to the side for now. But so the first theory, generally debunked, is that there's actual behavioral differences. Second theory that dominates is a disparate treatment theory. Teachers treat some students differently than others, even when they're engaging in the same behavior. Two students do the same thing. One gets sent to the principal's office, the other didn't. So that's a second theory. And that theory actually has been shown to explain a lot. So a couple of the sort of leading studies suggest that sort of disparate treatment can explain upwards of 45% of the discipline gap. Another key explanation is what I'm referring to here as organizational culture. And by that, I mean different schools actually have different sets of policies, practices, approaches, views of students, and that organizational culture can lead to essentially disparate treatment, but not as a function of the student's racial identity, but just as the school. And it turns out that students who are racialized as Black are far more likely to go to schools that are highly punitive, engage in different forms of social control through sorting and, all sorts of things. But so on the board, we have three theories. One, behavioral differences, largely debunked. Two, disparate treatment, certainly a there, but can't explain everything. And the third is organizational culture, which is to say that it's not just individual level biases that might be leading to a discipline gap. It's actually something about the institution, about the school, the organization. And so, but again, so these are theories. So how might you figure out what is actually doing work here? And this is where we draw on the really incredible work from Dr. Owens, who she designs an experiment. Yeah. She says, look, there's some, and we'll post to the experiment because I'm sure there, or the study, because I'm sure there are some folks who want to read it closely. We, in the next 10 minutes only, are going to be able to highlight some of the key takeaways. But so she says she wants to know, and cognizant of all the limitations in the existing research, what is leading to discipline gaps along racial lines? So she creates an experiment, and part of the experiment involves these short video vignettes where she gets actors of different races, like high school aged boys, who are engaged in minor infractions, like slamming a door or texting in class or throwing a piece of paper. So she creates these videos. And so the videos are done so that the only meaningful difference that the viewer will see is the racial identity of the student. Behavior is going to be pretty much the same across the videos. And then she has participants. She gets almost 1,500 teachers from almost 300 schools across the US who represent a really nice cross-section of teachers and schools, both in sort of sense of middle school, high school, city, suburban, rural, demographics of the schools themselves where the teachers come from. So she's got these video vignettes that the participants watch. And then the participants have a job. They watch the video, then they're asked to describe the behavior. And this task is meant to assess whether or not and to what extent they perceive the behavior as innocuous or blameworthy. Then they're asked to answer just yes or no. Would this conduct lead to a referral to the principal's office? And then they're asked a number of other questions to gauge a few different things. So that's the basic setup. It's really thoughtful, creative study. And Dr. Owens has some questions that she is now going to be able to answer. Two of the questions are really focused on individual level behavior, and the third is organizational culture. So the first question, do teachers engage in what Dr. Owens refers to as blaming bias? And so blaming bias is if a teacher views the same conduct as more blameworthy if the student engaging in that conduct is racially identifiable as Black as opposed to white. So this is, just a sort of basic form of disparate treatment, but really about perception. It's not any action the teacher's taking, but do you perceive the same conduct as more blameworthy depending on who's engaging in it? And the answer is yes. I think for many of us, not surprising, statistically significant that the students racialized as Black are viewed as more blameworthy for the same conduct than those students racialized as white. And the difference is about a 0.16 standard deviation. So question 2, and so this is just about how you perceive behavior. Do teachers engage in referral bias? And so referral bias is the conduct. Would this conduct lead to a referral to the principal's office? And we know that referrals, that's a really important moment into the disciplinary process, because if you don't get referred, everything stops discipline-wise. But if you get referred, then that can lead to a lot of negative recursive processes.
It's in your portfolio, in other words, so that if it happens in the classroom, there's actually no record of it if they're not referred. If they're referred to the principal, then guess what? It now becomes a part of your permanent record that you've been referred to the principal. So it has consequences far beyond what actually happened in the classroom. Okay, keep going.
And the answer is yes. Again, for many of us, not surprising that there is a referral bias. And something that Dr. Owens is able to do a little bit here, which is really interesting, is try to hone in on, well, what is the driver of that referral bias? And it turns out that blaming bias. So again, the perception that the same behavior is more blameworthy if it was a kid who was racialized as Black doing it, that explains over a quarter of the gap. It's not explaining everything, but part of that perception of blameworthiness is driving this referral bias. But that also means that almost 75% of referral bias is occurring even when teachers view the same conduct as equally blameworthy, which is also really interesting. So teachers, same thing, equally blameworthy, but still more likely to send students racialized as Black to the principal, and a meaningful increase. And so these are two dynamics that we can think of as sort of occurring at the level of the individual teacher that are helping to explain why Black students are more likely to be disciplined, that we know because of the videos have nothing to do with behavioral differences.
So let me just ask a question, though. Yeah. So then what I'm hearing is that then because of the organizational culture, maybe there is greater acceptance or reward for referring to the principal if it's a Black student versus a white student, even though the teacher knows that the behavior is the same and that there really isn't. But given the organizational culture, there is pushback if you refer a white student. There is no pushback if you refer a Black student. Could that be the other piece that is also part of how the teacher is processing, knowing that there's going to be support for one, but no support for the other?
So I want to pause and really mark this as an important moment, because what you're doing, Arnie, right now is you're theorizing. Yes. Well, we're not suggesting we necessarily know the answer, but we're trying to think of all the different dynamics that could lead to an outcome, these disciplinary gaps that we view as unjust. Folks like DeSantis are trying to prevent students from being able to ask those questions and answer those questions. And like, we should never suggest that one particular study answers everything definitively, but it does offer new data points that can help us better understand the world. And we are in a moment where, there's this increasing impulse just to prevent students from being able to ask these sorts of critical questions. But you asked a really interesting question, and Dr. Owens even suggests that, well, we don't necessarily know whether something like referral bias is actually going to be more pronounced at a school that is predominantly white or a school that's predominantly Black. Like, that's a really interesting question. Like, and then what could drive the difference? But here's something really interesting that she finds that goes to organizational culture. And so she wants to know, as a function of, among other things, the racial demographics of the student body, does that affect perceptions of blameworthiness and referral? So does it affect blaming bias and referral bias? And the answer is yes, but it's not just for Black students. In schools that are predominantly Black, or where the racial demographics of students are predominantly Black, teachers are more likely to view the same conduct as more blameworthy among all students, which is to say that the white kid doing the same thing is more likely to be viewed as blameworthy if it's occurring in a school that is predominantly Black as opposed to predominantly white. And what she finds is that there's a statistically significant increase in universal perceptions of blameworthiness for each percentage point higher of Black or Latinx enrollment in the school, which is suggesting that there is something about organizational culture. And so organizational culture, it's an admittedly amorphous phrase. We would want to be more concrete about precisely what we mean. But what the insight is suggesting is there's something about the institution that leads teachers to view certain arguably innocuous misconduct as blameworthy and deserving of discipline. And so that might lead us to ask a number of other questions. Well, what is it about those schools? Like, what is it that creates this sort of amorphous thing that we think of as institutional culture? Is it just the demographics and then associations we have with different people as a function of racial identity or groups? Is it something about policies? Is that certain schools are more punitive in nature? They have zero-sum policies where they immediately go to discipline and others don't. And then a different question is, well, why are certain students sorted into these schools that we know are more punitive and engage in more social control? And so those are all sort of really important questions that we would want to ask. But the upshot, the key is that study like this provides really nice insight that no one's arguing over the fact that there are disparities. But we know, A, that behavioral differences are not the reason, and B, the reason cannot be explained by individual level biases alone. And so what that means is if you just sort of had a magic wand and zapped implicit bias, it wouldn't erase the discipline gap, because there's something distinct and separate from the sort of mental or psychological associations we hold as individuals that is driving these disparities.
We're talking with Jonathan Feingold. We're talking about why does inequality persist? Organizational culture matters. I'm thinking really quickly, Jonathan, I was a fellow at Harvard, and I wanted to have a course that was entitled, "You have to lose, lose, lose to win." Okay, it's a quote by Bella Abzug. And I was pulled aside and said, "Arnie, you can't have that title. We don't have losers here." That's what they were told. That's the culture. Okay. I want to explain the culture really quickly because it was like, oh my God. But that was the organizational culture. And I think that that's terribly important. And I want you to repeat how you opened this segment with the story of the article about the AP course from 2022 versus the AP course for 2023. I think it's terribly important. Yes, it's a word, but it's a word that actually defines this whole conversation. Can you again repeat what those numbers were? Because I want my audience to have them imprinted in their brain.
And I'm drawing on a Washington Post article by Nick Anderson that Arnie and I can post so people can read it. But he just counted the number of times certain words appeared in the college Board's AP African American Studies curriculum in April 2022 and February 2023, after intervention from DeSantis and his administration. One word was systemic. That went from 9 in April 2022 to 0 in 2023. Some other words I'll just throw out there. Womanism went from 14 to 0. Incarceration, 15 to 1. Reparations, 15 to 1. Intersectionality, 19 to 1. Kimberly Crenshaw, 5 to 0. Movement for Black Lives, 6 to 0.
And
Colin
on that
Powell,
note, Colin
0
Powell?
to 3.
Oh my God. Oh, I thank Jonathan Feingold. This is Race Class, episode 15. Why does inequality persist? Organizational culture matters. Jonathan Feingold is a professor of law at Boston University. And now you know why you take race class, because we know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means. Thank you so much, Professor Feingold. This was incredibly enlightening. I appreciate it. Talk to you next month.
Thanks, Arnie.
This is the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnest and